There is a shore at the edge of the ancient world, where the sea meets the land without hurry, where the water does not crash but simply arrives, spending itself gently against pale stones worn smooth across 1,000 years. The light there, in those deep, immeasurable ages before the age of iron, before the age of empires and their marble columns, was softer than the light we know now. Or perhaps it only seems that way from this great distance. The evening comes down slowly in that imagined place, spreading itself like a cloth of indigo and faded gold across the surface of the Aegean, and the waves settle lower and lower with each passing breath, until the whole world seems to be breathing together, slowly, quietly, finding its rest. You are here now, in that slow exhale, drifting on the edge of a story that has waited thousands of years to be told in the dark. Told quietly, told to someone who has finally stopped moving and simply allows the ancient tide to carry them somewhere deep and still. The name we are following tonight is Achilles. And yet, before we can speak of the man and the warrior and the grief that shook the very walls of Troy, we must first travel to the place where all things begin, to the quiet origins of an impossible life, to a wedding held on a mountain where gods walked openly among mortals and the stars burned closer to the earth than they do now. The mountain was Pelion, rising in great green folds above the coast of Thessaly, draped in forests of ancient pine and oak, whose roots reached into the dark rock beneath the soil, drinking from underground rivers that no human hand had ever mapped. The air on Pelion moved slowly between the trees, carrying the scent of resin and damp stone and the distant brine of the sea. And in the clearings, the grass grew thick and soft, silver green in the light of dusk. This was a mountain that remembered everything. The mountain had seen the seasons turn so many times that its silence had become a kind of wisdom, unhurried and vast and warm. It was on this mountain that a wedding was held, and the wedding was attended by the gods. They came down from Olympus across the long distances of sky and sea, drifting through the air like embers from a great fire, and they gathered in the meadows of Pelion as the torches were lit, as the tables were spread, as the music of lyres and flutes curled upward into the early dark. The mortal groom was Peleus, a warrior of great renown, a man who had sailed with Jason and hunted the great boar of Calydon, a man whose name was already woven into the songs of his time. The bride was Thetis, a Nereid, a sea nymph of immeasurable beauty and power, daughter of the ancient sea itself, carrying within her the cool depths of the ocean and the weight of all that lay beneath. The marriage was not one born of love, not at its beginning. Among the gods, a whisper had moved for centuries, half warning and half prophecy, that Thetis was destined to bear a son greater than his father, And because Zeus himself, the king of all the gods, had once desired her, and because he understood very well the violence of sons who surpassed their fathers, for he had done so himself against Cronus, and Cronus before him against Uranus, the king of the gods made a swift, quiet decision. Thetis would marry mortal. Her son would be great and heroic and brilliant as a blade catching sunlight, but he would be mortal. He would be bound by the merciful, inevitable limits of a human life. He would die. Thetis resisted. The ancient accounts speak of her fury, of how she shifted herself into fire, into the roar of a lion, into the cold thrash of a serpent, trying to escape the grip of fate and of her mortal husband. But it was no use. The gods had decreed, and the wedding proceeded, and the music played on beneath the pines of Pelion, and somewhere in the gentle commotion of that divine evening, the future of a hero was quietly decided. When Achilles was born, Thetis held him in her arms and understood with the full depth of her Nereid heart that he was beautiful and extraordinary and doomed. A mother who is ageless, who has watched the ocean's floor for millennia and felt the cold weight of the deep, understands grief differently than a mortal woman. For Thetis, the grief arrived before the tragedy. It settled into her like a stone settling slowly to the bottom of a clear lake, without noise, without struggle, simply descending through the still water until it came to rest in the soft silt below. And so she tried to change what the gods had decreed. The ancient stories, the oldest ones, speak of her holding the infant Achilles in sacred fire during the long hours of night, coating him with the shining salve of ambrosia, attempting to burn away the mortal parts of him the way a smith burns away the impurities in bronze, leaving only the pure, bright metal behind. Peleus, waking in the darkness, glimpsing the terrible, sacred light of it through the doorway, cried out and rushed to take the child from the flames, and what was left, in some of the older accounts, was a small, burnt place on the foot. A scar that the myth would later transform, through centuries of retelling, into something more elegant, more memorable, a detail so clear it carved itself permanently into the language of the world. The version most people carry with them, even now, even so many thousands of years later, is the one that came from the Roman poet Statius, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, long after Homer, long after the age of heroes. In his telling, Thetis carried the infant down to the edge of the underworld itself, to the banks of the river Styx, that dark and sacred waterway around which souls drifted like smoke. The river was cold and still, and of a colour that had no name in any living language. She held the child by his left heel and lowered him into the water, and where the water touched him, nothing could ever harm him again. The darkness of the river conferred its protection like a cloak settling over his shoulders, every inch of him sealed against the violence of the world, except for that single small patch of skin where her fingers held him above the current. She lifted him out of the Styx, and the water dripped from him slowly in the deep quiet of the underworld, and she wrapped him again in her arms and carried him back up toward the light, knowing that she had done what she could, knowing that it was not enough, knowing that it would never quite be enough, because nothing can entirely outrun what the gods have decided will be. Thetis eventually left Peleus. The ancient stories are not entirely gentle about this departure. The marriage had never been easy, the distance between mortal and divine being a distance not measured in miles or years, but in the fundamental substance of being. She returned to the sea, to the cool green darkness below the surface, where time moved differently, where a century felt like an afternoon, and she left her son in the hands of his father. Peleus, understanding that the boy was extraordinary, and that his own hands and his own household were perhaps not equal to the task of raising what Achilles was becoming, made the decision that many wise fathers of that age made. He entrusted the child to a teacher greater than himself. The centaur Chiron lived on Mount Pelion still, in the long, beautiful quiet of the forests where the wedding had been held, and he was unlike any being that walked the earth in that age. Half man, half horse, he moved through the meadows and the pine groves with a slow, unhurried grace, his hooves silent on the deep moss, his hands capable of extraordinary gentleness. He was the tutor of heroes, the keeper of old knowledge, celebrated across the Greek world as the wisest of his kind, having taught Jason his seamanship, having given Asclepius the first understanding of medicine, having shaped and steadied and educated a generation of extraordinary men. His name in the ancient language of Greece meant something close to hand, something about the skill and dexterity of the fingers, the knowledge that lives in the hands. When Achilles came to him, newly renamed from the birth name Lycaon, the centaur received the child without ceremony or ceremony's fuss. There was only the mountain and the trees and the particular quality of the light that filtered through pine branches in the late afternoon, turning everything amber and slow. Chiron taught Achilles to ride, to run across the mountain in the long golden hours of early morning, when the dew still clung to every blade of grass, and the world smelled clean and cold and open. He taught him the careful, patient arts of hunting, how to read the soft ground for the passage of animals, how to move without disturbing the air. He taught him to use the spear, and later he would present to Peleus as a wedding gift all those years ago, and now bequeathed to the son, a great ashwood spear, perfectly balanced, so heavy that no ordinary man could lift it with a single hand, a weapon that would become as famous in the stories of Troy as the walls of the city itself. But the curriculum of the centaur was not only war. In the frescoes found centuries later in the buried rooms of Herculaneum, preserved in ash and silence for nearly 2,000 years, until excavators brought them back into the light, there is an image of Chiron sitting with Achilles, the boy perched close, and between them a lyre. The image is quiet and domestic in its warmth, almost impossibly so given what the boy would become. Achilles learned music on that mountain, learned to run his fingers across the strings until sound came, low and resonant and warm, filling the space of the cave that was Chiron's home with something that the cold and the rock and the far-off sea could not provide. Something human and intimate and soft. He learned also from Chiron the ancient knowledge of plants, the ones that stop bleeding, the ones that calm fever, the ones that ease the body when injury has left it shaking and uncertain. He learned to stitch wounds and to bind them, to stand at a soldier's side in the aftermath of violence and offer something gentle. Homer himself would later note this double education, this twinned fluency in harm and in healing, and it would be recorded that on the plains of Troy, Achilles and his companion Patroclus would dress each other's wounds with the herbs and the techniques they had learned together, there in the quiet of the centaur's mountain, long before the war had even begun to gather on the horizon of their young lives. There is an obscure, strange, and somehow poetic fragment of the myth that concerns the question of Achilles' legendary speed. In one version, preserved by an ancient scholar writing centuries after the main tradition had settled, Chiron discovered something in his long years of learning, something about an ancient giant named Demesis, remembered in the oldest stories as the fastest runner who had ever lived. When Demesis had died and been buried and passed entirely out of the mortal world, his bones remained, and within those bones something of his extraordinary swiftness was preserved. The way a fragrance clings to an empty room long after the flower is gone. Chiron, in this telling, retrieved the ankle bone of the giant and used it to restore and transform Achilles' injured foot, the foot that had been damaged in Thetis' fire. And from that bone and that old, strange surgery came the speed that Homer would celebrate through the entire length of the Iliad, calling the hero swift-footed so many times that the phrase became almost a second name, a shadow that ran beside him always across the long, dusty plains and the beaches of ancient Asia. The mountain held him for years, and the years passed on Pelion the way years pass in high places, with a quality of stillness that is not emptiness, but fullness, the way a very deep pool appears dark and still at the surface, while below it the water moves slowly through channels carved by the patience of centuries. Achilles grew. He ran the mountain paths in the cool of morning. He played the lyre in the evenings when the fire was low and Chiron sat nearby, and the stars over Pelion were close and indifferent and beautiful. He learned and waited, and was shaped by that quiet mountain into something that the world below, when it finally called for him, would not know what to do with except aim toward Troy. And Troy was waiting. It had been waiting for a long time. Settled on its hill above the plain, its walls built by the hands of gods, and therefore not easily broken. The world was gathering itself toward a war, but the mountain did not rush. The mountain simply kept its silence, and the fire in Chiron's cave burned low, and the stars continued their slow, ancient turning over the forests of Pelion. and Achilles slept the deep sleep of a young life, not yet tested, not yet spent, breathing quietly in the dark. All of that was still ahead. For now, the mountain held him, and the night held the mountain, and the darkness was warm and safe and slow as water. The lyre rested against the cave wall. The fire settled to coals. The great ash spear leaned in its corner, still and patient and heavy and waiting. And outside the sea moved in the far distance below, murmuring the way it always murmurs when night has fully arrived. A sound without edges, without urgency, without end. The island of Scyros rose from the Aegean like a thought half remembered, its cliffs pale and salt-scoured, its interior hills draped in the silver green of olive groves and wild thyme, the whole place surrounded on all sides by water that shifted its colour through the long hours of the day, from deep violet in the early morning to a flat hammered bronze at noon, to something softer and harder to name at the falling of evening. A colour that had no word in any language, but that the sea seemed to know by heart. It was to this island that Thetis brought her son, wrapping him in a disguise the way the sea wraps a rock, smoothly and completely, concealing what lies beneath. The war was coming. It had been coming for a long time, gathering itself the way a storm gathers, slowly and then all at once, pulling the ships of 100 kingdoms toward a single point on the coast of Asia Minor, where the city of Troy sat on its ancient hill above the plain, its walls built by the hands of gods, its towers throwing long shadows across the silver grass of the Troad at evening. The causes of the war were many and tangled, as the causes of great things usually are, reaching back through layers of divine rivalry and human vanity, and one particular golden apple thrown with great carelessness into a wedding feast. But what mattered now? In the quiet years before it truly began, was the prophecy that Achilles carried with him like a stone in his chest. 2 roads lay before him, and both were clear, and the choice between them was so enormous and so simple that it could only be called a tragedy. The first road led home to Phthia, to the low hills of Thessaly, to a life of ordinary years and quiet evenings and the comfort of a world that would eventually forget his name. The second road led to Troy, to the thundering violence of the greatest war the ancient world had ever assembled, and at the end of that road, somewhere in the dust and the bronze rattle of the Trojan plain, a young death waited with absolute patience. But along that second road, before the death, before the ending, there was something the ancient Greeks valued above almost everything else that a mortal life could offer. There was Kleos, immortal glory, the assurance that songs would carry the name of Achilles across centuries, that the flame of his deeds would not gutter out when his body returned to the earth, but would continue burning, passed from voice to voice and generation to generation, until the world itself was unrecognizable and still the name remained. In the heroic world of the ancient Greeks, the afterlife offered very little comfort. The underworld, in the vision of Homer and the poets who followed him, was not a paradise or a punishment, not a reward for virtue or a suffering for vice. It was simply a dimming. The dead descended to the realm of Hades and became shadows of themselves, flickering and insubstantial, retaining the shape of who they had been without the warmth and weight of life. In that grey and quiet world, the coward and the champion suffered exactly the same condition. There was no distinction, and so the only true immortality available to a warrior of that age was the immortality of being remembered, of having lived so brightly and so completely that the living could not help but speak of it long after the living had themselves become the dead. Achilles understood this. He had understood it probably since Chiron first put a spear in his hand on the slopes of Pelion, since the philosophy of the heroic life had settled into him alongside the music and the medicine, since the long, clear mornings on the mountain had given him time to think about what kind of life was worth the trouble of living. He chose the second road. He chose Troy and the brief brilliance and the young death waiting at the end. But the choosing was not yet required of him, because Thetis, his mother, who lived in the cool green deep of the sea and felt the future approaching like a pressure change in the water, was not yet ready to allow it. She came for him quietly, the way the tide comes, and she brought him to Scyros, and she dressed him in women's clothing and settled him among the daughters of King Lycomedes in the palace on the hill above the sea. And she gave him a new name, Pyrrha, meaning something close to the colour of flame, which was perhaps a private joke, or perhaps simply an acknowledgement that, even disguised, even softened, even dressed in the garments of a court lady, something about her son still burned. The palace of Lycomedes was pleasant. The ancient stories do not dwell long in it, but one can imagine the quality of those hidden years. The sound of women's voices in the long colonnaded halls, the smell of wool and lamp oil, and the sea wind coming in through narrow windows. The particular slowness of days spent in relative safety at the edge of the world, while the wider world arranged itself for catastrophe. Achilles moved among the daughters of the king, and he was careful, and he was patient, and somewhere in those years he found a companion in the king's daughter Didamia, and with her he had a son who would be named Neoptolemus, and who would one day become a warrior in his own right, carrying something of his father's terrible gift into the final days of the war his father had begun. But the Greeks had their own oracle, and their oracle said plainly what the world seemed already to sense in its bones, that Troy could not fall without Achilles. The prophecy was specific and immovable and deeply inconvenient, and the men who were assembling the largest fleet the ancient world had seen, who were calling in every debt and alliance and obligation across the Greek kingdoms, who were weighing their grievances and their honour and their willingness to die for a queen who had gone willingly or unwillingly, depending on who told the story, to a foreign shore, Those men needed the one fighter who the gods had seemingly built from divine raw materials, and aimed specifically at walls that would not otherwise come down. Odysseus was dispatched to find him. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, the cleverest of all the Greeks, the man for whom cleverness was not merely a talent, but a way of existing in the world, a lens through which every problem became a puzzle, and every puzzle yielded eventually to a patient mind, came to the island of Scyros in the guise of a merchant, his ship heavy with goods that he allowed to be seen, and goods that he kept carefully below the others. He spread his wares in the hall of Lycomedes with the easy generosity of a man who has nothing to hide, and the daughters of the king gathered around the fabrics and the jewelry, the worked gold earrings and the bright woven cloth that shimmered in the light of the tall windows. And among the fabrics and the gold and the beautiful, useful things of women's lives, Odysseus had placed, with great care and casual deliberateness, a sword. A single sword, polished and long and elegant as a winter river, lying among the soft things, the way a cold fact lies among comfortable assumptions. Then, at a signal arranged beforehand, a trumpet sounded outside the palace walls. Not an attack, not a real one, but the sound of it was the sound of threat, sudden and brass-edged and unmistakable. And it moved through the hall like a wind through tall grass, and the daughters of Lycomedes startled and pressed together and looked toward the doors. And one of the young women, one who had been quiet and watchful in the way of someone accustomed to containing themselves, reached past the silks and the earrings and closed her hand around the sword, and was no longer Pyrrha. The disguise dissolved like salt in warm water. There stood Achilles, and the room was changed. Odysseus met his eyes across the distance of the hall, and something passed between them that the ancient stories do not record in words, but that is easy enough to feel. A recognition, a kind of relief on both their parts, an acknowledgement that the pretending was over, and the real thing, whatever it was, whatever it would cost them, was about to begin. Achilles did not hesitate long. His nature was not built for hesitation. He had made his choice already, years before, on the slopes of Pelion, in the long, clear mornings, and the choice had simply been waiting for him to arrive at the moment when it became action. He took command of the Myrmidons, those dark-armoured fighters who had waited for him with the steady patience of soldiers who believe in their general, the way the earth believes in the weight it carries. And he sailed to join the armada gathering across the Aegean, a fleet so large that its sails were said to darken the horizon the way storm clouds do. The wood of 1,000 ships groaning and settling in the long swells between the islands. The fleet assembled at Aulis, where the winds refused to blow. There are darker stories here, stories involving a priest and a goddess, and a sacrifice that the history of the world has never entirely decided how to hold. And those stories belong to other nights. What matters for this night is that eventually the fleet moved, crossing the water between Greece and Asia Minor with the accumulated weight of 10 years of ambition and grievance and prophecy pressing it forward, and the soldiers felt the current shift beneath them, and Asia grew on the horizon, pale and enormous and patient. The landing on the shores of Troy was not without its darkness. A prophecy, relentless as the sea, had declared that the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil was fated to be the first Greek to die in the war. The fleet hesitated at the beach, the oars held still, the soldiers looking at one another in the particular silence it falls when danger has been made specific and immediate. Odysseus, trusting his cleverness as he always did, threw his shield onto the sand and leaped onto it, technically touching not the soil of Troy, but his own bronze and leather, which satisfied the terms of the prophecy in a way that satisfied no one entirely. And then Protesilaus, the leader of the Phylicians, a man whose name means something like first of the people, stepped past him and put his foot on the foreign earth. And the prophecy was fulfilled, and Hector was there to fulfill it for him, and Protesilaus fell before he had time to understand what he had done, and his death became the first measure of the cost. Achilles moved through those early days of the war the way weather moves, the way a cold front moves across a landscape that has no defense against it except to accept it and wait for the other side. He killed Sickness, a son of Poseidon, at the water's edge, while the army was still sorting itself from the confusion of the landing, and the feat was noted and marvelled at, and quickly absorbed into the larger urgency of everything else that needed doing. He killed Tenes, a son of Apollo, on the island of Tenedos. And here the story slows for a moment, the way water slows at a deep place, because Thetis had warned him, specifically and clearly, and with all the directness of a mother who has already understood more of the future than she wishes to know, that killing Tenes would mean killing himself eventually, that Apollo would not forgive it, that the god would carry the debt forward with infinite patience and call it in at the worst possible moment. Achilles killed Tenes anyway. He was not a man who could be turned from a thing by the knowledge that it would cost him. His nature ran the other direction entirely, toward the cost, toward the fire, toward the bright burning place where the consequence of a choice became the thing that made the choice worth making. Apollo took note. The god was patient, as gods are, understanding that vengeance kept cool is vengeance made more precise, and he filed the debt away in whatever place a god keeps such things, and returned to watching. The war settled into itself as long sieges do, finding its rhythms of violence and waiting, of early morning raids and long afternoons of relative stillness while the dust settled and the wounded were carried from the field. The walls of Troy refused. Poseidon and Apollo had built those walls in an earlier age, as the ancient stories recorded it, and their work did not come apart easily for the hammers and the siege engines of mortal men. The fighting moved, therefore, away from the walls themselves, spreading outward across the landscape of the Troad, into the smaller towns and farming settlements and allied kingdoms that sustained the great city with grain and bronze and manpower. Achilles led his Myrmidons on raid after raid through those long middle years of the war, moving along the coastline of Asia Minor with the swift, terrible efficiency that had always been his defining quality, the efficiency of something that had been made specifically for this purpose and had finally arrived at the task it was made for. He sacked Lyrnessus and Pedasus and a dozen other settlements whose names survive only in fragments and footnotes, places whose walls were not built by gods and therefore came apart more honestly. He captured wealth and weapons and captives, sending back to the Greek camp the material evidence of a campaign that was, in these particular quarters, going extremely well. He fought Telephus on the plain of Mysia and wounded him, and the wound refused to heal, and Telephus eventually came to the Greeks not as an enemy, but as a suppliant, bearing an oracle that said, only the weapon that had made the wound could also heal it. And so Achilles scraped rust from his spear into the wound, and it closed, a detail that the ancient world found deeply satisfying, and that we might read as something about the dual nature of the man himself, that same quality Chiron had built into him on the mountain, the knowledge of harm and the knowledge of healing, held together in the same pair of hands. He encountered Troilus, a young Trojan prince, in a story too complicated and too quiet for the battlefield, a story that other poets would take up and reshape across the centuries until Shakespeare eventually gave it an entire play of its own. The details vary in the telling. What the ancient sources agree on is that Troilus died, and that his death was part of the long accumulation of Trojan grief that would one day press itself into a single, enormous breaking point. The years moved across the plain of Troy the way years move across any flat landscape, slowly, and with a quality of sameness that conceals the accumulation of time, until you look up and realize that a great deal of it has passed. The Greek soldiers grew older in their camp by the ships. The Trojans endured behind their walls. The gods watched from whatever height gods watched from, occasionally reaching down to adjust the outcome of a particular skirmish, the way a person adjusts a blanket in the night, pulling one edge, smoothing another, not entirely certain why they are doing it, but unable to stop. Achilles moved through it all with the fierce, exhausting brightness of someone who has decided to spend themselves completely, and is doing so with great thoroughness. The 10th year was coming. In the deep counting of the war, in the accumulated weight of a decade of separation from home and family and the smell of ordinary life, the 10th year was arriving, and with it, without anyone knowing it yet, the specific weeks that Homer would one day stretch across the entire length of the Iliad, weeks so dense with consequence that they would expand in the telling to fill the whole of the story, leaving the other 9 years compressed into background and prologue. The dispute had not yet happened. The rage had not yet arrived. The name for it had not yet been spoken aloud in any assembly of men. But something was gathering in the air over the Greek camp by the shore, some pressure building in the long evenings when the cooking fires burned low, and the soldiers talked less, and the sound of the sea against the hulls of the ships continued its patient, indifferent music. The world was holding its breath, the way the air holds its breath between two gusts of wind, in that particular stillness that comes not from peace, but from the brief, suspended interval before everything changes. The fires at the camp's edge burned lower and lower as the hour grew late. The smoke drifted upward into the dark, unwinding slowly, becoming nothing. The sea continued its murmuring in the dark, old and untroubled and deep. The same sea that Thetis moved through far away in the green cool of the deep water, knowing what was coming, feeling it in the currents the way any mother feels the approach of the thing she cannot prevent. And the soldiers slept, those who could sleep, wrapped in their cloaks on the warm ground, breathing slowly together in the dark of the camp. 10 years from home, on the edge of the last decisive year. The word that begins the Iliad is not the name of a hero. It is not the name of a city, or a god, or a king. It is a single word in the ancient Greek, menace. And it arrives at the very start of Homer's poem, like a stone dropped into still water, sending its rings outward through everything that follows. The word means wrath, or rage, or fury, but those translations carry only the surface of it. In the broader literature of ancient Greece, menace was a word almost exclusively reserved for the anger of gods, the vast, indiscriminate, world-altering force of divine displeasure, the kind of anger that does not pass quickly and does not target narrowly, but spreads across everything within reach, the way floodwater spreads across a low plain. For Homer to apply this specific word to a mortal man, to Achilles, to the son of Peleus, was a deliberate and enormous statement, a signal given before the first scene had even opened, that what was about to unfold was not merely a quarrel between commanders, but something of cosmic proportion, something that would determine the fates of thousands, without those thousands having any real say in the matter. The quarrel that ignited this cosmic rage was, on its surface, a quarrel about a woman. Or rather, it was a quarrel that wore the face of a woman, but carried inside it the full weight of a warrior society's deepest anxieties about power, respect, and the meaning of a man's worth. Among the Greeks, honor was not an abstract virtue. It was a material reality, measurable and public and transferable. The ancient Greek word for it was time, and it functioned in the heroic world the way currency functions in ours, as the medium through which value was recognized and exchanged and accumulated. A warrior demonstrated his time through his skill in battle, and the evidence of that skill was the prizes he was awarded afterward, the word for which was gerus, meaning the physical tokens of acknowledged supremacy, the looted gold, the crafted armor, the captive women who represented not love or desire necessarily, but the concrete, visible proof that a man had fought harder and better than the man he had fought against. To take a man's geras was to erase his public record, to say, in the most legible possible language, that his achievement did not matter, that he was less than he believed himself to be. Into this delicate system of honor and its material evidence, the plague arrived first. Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae, the supreme commander of the Greek coalition, the man whose authority over the assembled army was broad, but not unconditional, had claimed as his personal captive a young woman named Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo named Chryses. When Chryses came to the Greek camp with a formal ransom and the staff of Apollo, seeking his daughter's return, Agamemnon refused him and sent him away with harsh words, and the old priest walked back to the shore in his grief and his humiliation, and he prayed to Apollo with the specific, detailed prayer of a man who has nothing left but the ear of a god, and believes in that ear completely. Apollo listened. Apollo, who had already catalogued his grievances against Achilles and the Greek army, who moved through the ancient world with the patient accumulating hostility of a god whose offerings have not been properly made, and whose children have not been properly respected. Apollo reached for his silver bow, and what followed was not the dramatic violence of lightning or earthquake, but something slower and more terrible. Invisible arrows of plague that fell silently into the Greek camp, finding the mules first, then the dogs, then the men. The funeral pyres burning day and night at the edge of the shore, the smoke rising and drifting over the dark water, the number of the dying increasing with each morning's accounting. 9 days of it. 9 days before Achilles, whose nature was not built to endure a thing passively when action was available, called an assembly of the army and demanded that a seer tell them the cause. Calchas, the prophet, who knew what he knew and was afraid of what it would cost him to say it, asked for the protection of Achilles before he spoke. Achilles granted it, and Calchas told the truth, which was that the cause of the plague was Agamemnon's treatment of the priest, and that the only remedy was the return of Chryseis without ransom. Agamemnon was publicly furious in the way of a powerful man who has been publicly reduced. He agreed to return the girl because he had no real choice, with 9 days of the dead already counted. But he announced simultaneously that his loss of Deras required immediate replacement, that the honour taken from him had to be replaced by honour taken from someone else, and his eyes moved across the assembly with the particular, dangerous quality of a man who has already decided where they will land. They landed on Achilles. The confiscation of Briseis, the captive woman who had been awarded to Achilles as the acknowledged prize of his military supremacy, the concrete, public token of his time in the heroic accounting system that defined the worth of every man in that army, was an act so precisely calibrated to wound Achilles where he could not afford to be wounded, that it is difficult, reading the ancient text across all these centuries, not to feel the impact of it even now. Achilles had already chosen to sacrifice his long life for the possibility of Kleos. He had traded away his future in exchange for the guarantee that his name and his deeds would be remembered. And now, the supreme commander of the coalition was publicly stripping away the visible evidence of those deeds, reducing him in front of the entire army, saying with the act itself that Achilles' honour was available for redistribution whenever a king decided he needed more of it. Achilles stood at the edge of killing Agamemnon where he stood. The ancient text is specific about this, about the hand moving toward the sword, about the particular interior violence of a moment when the body has already decided what the mind has not yet confirmed. And then Athena arrived, visible only to Achilles, arriving from Olympus at the request of Hera, and she gripped him by his bright hair and spoke to him in a low, specific voice. And what she said was essentially that the future would arrange itself more satisfactorily if he stopped the sword now and used words instead, and that he would receive 3 times the compensation eventually if he chose patience over blood. Achilles stopped. He chose words. But the words he chose were not the words of patience. He declared before the whole assembly that he was done. He was withdrawing himself and his myrmidons from the fighting. He was going to sit by his ships and watch, and the Greeks could manage without him, and they would find out soon enough what his absence meant, and Agamemnon could face whatever came without the protection of the one fighter who had been holding the balance of the entire war together. He spoke with the fury of a man who has been told that the price of his sacrifice is simply more sacrifice, with no end and no acknowledgement and no possibility of ever having given enough. And then he went to the shore and sat down and wept. This detail too is specific in Homer and important, and easy to pass over too quickly in the urgency of everything else that surrounds it. Achilles, the swiftest and most terrifying warrior in the Greek world, went to the edge of the grey sea and sat down and wept, calling out to his mother in the way of a child who is hurt beyond the capacity of words. And Thetis heard him from the deep place where she lived among her sisters in the cold water, and she rose through the surface of the sea and sat with him on the shore and held his hands and listened, the way a mother listens, completely and without interruption. He asked her to go to Zeus, to ask the king of the gods to turn the tide of the war against the Greeks, to make them suffer in his absence, to prove to Agamemnon and to everyone watching that the removal of Achilles from the fighting was not a gesture, but a catastrophe. Thetis hesitated. She knew the cost of this request. She knew everything it would set in motion. But she was his mother, and he was weeping on the shore. And she went to Olympus, and she asked. Zeus agreed, and the war changed. Without Achilles, the Greek lines discovered their actual shape, which was the shape of something that had been held up artificially for a long time and now, with the prop removed, was sagging under its own weight. Hector, the great prince of Troy, the eldest son of old Priam, the best fighter the Trojans had, and a man who understood warfare not as a performance of individual glory, but as a responsibility borne on behalf of everyone behind his city's walls, felt the change immediately. He led the Trojan forces out across the plain in a sustained offensive that pushed the Greeks back in ways that had not happened in years, driving them toward their ships with the systematic efficiency of a man who sees an opportunity and knows how to use it. The gods moved on both sides of the fighting, as they always did in those strange and enormous days when divine interests were still tangled up with mortal ones, when a god might step onto the actual battlefield and shoulder an actual spear, and change the momentum of an actual engagement before stepping back again into the untouchable light of the divine. Hera and Athena worked to help the Greeks where they could. Apollo worked to help the Trojans. Poseidon and Ares shifted their weights back and forth across the balance. But the absence of Achilles was heavier than any divine intervention, and the Greeks could feel it. Agamemnon sent an embassy. 3 men arrived at the tent of Achilles by the ships, with the authority of the high command behind them, bearing an offer that had been assembled with care, the kind of offer that was meant to be impossible to refuse. There was an enormous quantity of gold. There was the return of Briseis, untouched, with a sworn oath to prove it. There were 7 cities, 7 whole cities with their fields and their harbours and their populations of craftsmen and farmers and soldiers to be given to Achilles as personal dominion if he would simply come back. There were Agamemnon's own daughters in marriage, any one of them with a dowry of extraordinary proportion. There was, in other words, the replacement of time on an almost absurd scale, the kind of compensation that should have resolved any honour dispute in the heroic world immediately and completely. Achilles refused it all. He refused it in a long speech that is one of the strangest and most unsettling moments in the Iliad, because what he says in it is not the complaint of a man who wants more compensation or better terms. What he says is something closer to the articulation of a man who has looked at the entire structure of the heroic life and found it hollow. Both the coward and the hero go to the same underworld, he says, and says it with the bluntness of someone who has been carrying the thought for a long time and has finally found the occasion to say it aloud. The man who fights and the man who hides receive the same reward in the end. So what exactly is the contract, and why should he honour it when the other party has already broken it so completely? He talked about going home to Phthia, about the long life and the slow years, and the obscurity of a man who chooses to survive. He said it the way someone talks about a thing they have considered seriously, not as a threat exactly, but as an alternative that had stopped feeling entirely impossible. The embassy went back to Agamemnon empty-handed, and the crisis deepened, and the Trojans pressed closer to the ships. And then Patroclus came to him. Patroclus had been there from the beginning, from Phthia, from childhood, from the day he had arrived in Peleus's household as a young exile, having fled his own home after an accident that the ancient texts record with a particular brevity of something genuinely painful, a quarrel over a game that had gone terribly wrong, a child dead, the weight of it too heavy for a boy to carry alone. Peleus had received him without judgment and set him beside Achilles, and the 2 boys had grown up together in the household and then on the mountain under Chiron's hands. And whatever had developed between them in those years had by now become the kind of bond for which the ordinary words of friendship or companionship are simply not adequate. They had educated each other. They had trained beside each other. They had sailed to Troy together and fought beside each other and tended each other's wounds in the long, slow evenings after the day's fighting was done. Homer speaks of the love of Achilles for Patroclus in terms that are among the most direct emotional statements in the entire epic, direct enough that the ancient Greeks who came after, reading the text in their own cultural context, in which relationships between men of deep devotion and physical intimacy were a recognized and honored part of aristocratic and military life, understood the bond as romantic, as the fullest kind of love that two people could offer each other. Plato wrote about it in the Symposium, and his characters debated which of the two was the lover and which the beloved, with the affectionate seriousness of people who take the question seriously because the people who lived it had taken it seriously. Aeschylus wrote a trilogy about it, now lost to time, in which the erotic and the heroic were completely intertwined. For the ancient world that inherited Homer's story, Achilles and Patroclus were the definitive image of what devotion between companions could look like at its most complete and most costly. Patroclus came to Achilles in tears, and Achilles, seeing him, was moved in the way that only one specific person can move us, in the place inside that is not accessible to argument or reason or embassy. But he was not yet moved enough. He was still caught in the enormous gravity of his own wrath, still orbiting the original insult with the momentum of a celestial body that cannot simply stop because the conditions have changed. He could not bring himself to return to the fighting, but he could give Patroclus something. The compromise they arrived at was Patroclus's idea, or at least the ancient text gives it to him, and the giving of it is a form of literary generosity, because what Patroclus was asking for was not a small thing. He asked to borrow Achilles' armor, the distinctive, shining, unmistakable armor that every Trojan on the plain had learned to fear, and to lead the Myrmidons into the battle in Achilles' place, his silhouette against the smoke and dust of the fighting, close enough to the real thing to create for a few crucial hours the psychological effect of the real thing, the panic and the retreat that the mere appearance of Achilles could generate among troops who had spent 10 years learning to understand what that armor meant when it moved toward them. Achilles agreed. He gave Patroclus the armor, and he gave him the Myrmidons, and he gave him specific, careful instructions. Go to the ships, drive the Trojans back, give the Greeks room to breathe, and then return. Do not pursue them to the walls. Do not push deeper into the Trojan lines than the immediate objective requires. Come back. The ruse worked beyond any reasonable expectation. The Trojans looked up from the burning ships and saw the armor of Achilles moving toward them across the plain, and their collective courage did what courage does when it encounters the thing it has been most afraid of. It gave way. The line broke. The pressure on the ships eased. The Greeks found themselves suddenly advancing where they had been retreating, and Patroclus was at the front of it, feeling something that the ancient storytellers understood very well: the dangerous intoxication of a battle turning in your favor, the momentum of a tide shifting under you. The way success in those circumstances does not feel like an invitation to stop, but like a demand to continue. He continued. He pushed past the ships. He pushed across the plain. He pushed all the way to the walls of Troy, which was the one specific place Achilles had told him not to go. And the walls were high and ancient and built by the hands of gods, and Apollo was watching from above with the particular attention of a god who recognizes the moment he has been waiting for. Apollo came down to Patroclus on the plain before the walls And what the god did was simple and devastating. He struck him from behind with an open palm, a blow that was not a wound exactly, but a disorienting, staggering impact that knocked his helmet from his head and his spear from his hands, and left him standing in the dust of the Trojan plain without the armor of protection that Achilles' name and Achilles' divine equipment had been providing. Stripped of the disguise in both its senses, the physical and the psychological, Patroclus stood exposed, and a Trojan named Euphorbus struck him first from behind with a spear, and Hector, seeing his opportunity, came forward and drove the killing blow home. Hector stripped the armor from Patroclus as Patroclus lay dying, the shining armor of Achilles. And in the moment of that stripping, the scale of what had happened became clear to everyone on the plain, who understood the language of such things, which was everyone. Patroclus died in the dust of the Trojan plain, the most loved person in the world of Achilles, in borrowed armor, within sight of the walls he had been explicitly told not to approach, and the world of the Iliad turned on its axis, without making any noise about it at all. The news arrived at the Greek camp in stages, the way catastrophic news usually arrives. The outriders first, then the formal account, then the body. Antilochus, the son of Nestor, was given the task of telling Achilles, and he chose to simply be present and say it plainly, sitting beside the hero and speaking the words, and then staying there, which was the right thing to do, and probably the only thing that could have been done in that moment. Achilles received the news in a way that the ancient text renders with extraordinary plainness, and therefore extraordinary force. He fell to the ground. He covered his face with dirt. He tore his hair. He made a sound that the women of the household heard and came running toward, and Thetis heard it in the deep water, far away, and rose again through the surface of the sea, and came to him again on the shore, and held him again in the way she had always held him when the world was too much, though the world had never been this much before. The wrath that had been consuming him from inside, that cosmic, divine-scale fury that Homer had named in the very first word of his poem, did not disappear. It transformed. It left Agamemnon entirely, released him the way a river releases a stone it has been carrying when it finds a steeper channel, and it redirected itself toward Hector, with a completeness and an intensity that made the previous months of sulking withdrawal seem, in retrospect, like a very small fire compared to what was now burning. Achilles declared that he was returning to the war. He declared it knowing what it meant. Thetis told him again, directly and without softening, that if he killed Hector, his own death would follow shortly after. He said that it did not matter. He said that he had failed to protect the person he loved most, that his anger and his withdrawal and his enormous justified grievance against Agamemnon had created the chain of events that put Patroclus on the plain in borrowed armor, within reach of a god who had been waiting for exactly this moment, and that the weight of that failure was heavier than the weight of his own survival, and that there was only one direction left to move in. He needed new armor. His own armor was on Hector's body. Thetis went to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, who lived in his workshop, somewhere in the deep heat beneath Olympus, and she asked for what was needed. And Hephaestus, who had a particular soft regard for Thetis, going back to an old kindness she had shown him, sat down at his bellows and his anvil, and worked through the night. What he made is described in the Iliad, in one of the most extended, elaborate passages in the entire poem. A shield so extraordinary in its craftsmanship that Homer devotes hundreds of lines to describing what is depicted on its surface. The cities of the living and the cities of the dead. The fields being ploughed in springtime, the vintage being gathered in autumn, the dances of young people in a meadow, the courts of justice, the armies in their formations, the ocean running around the entire outer rim of it, like a border of everything that exists, the whole world compressed into a circle of divine bronze that a god had made for a mortal to carry into the last and most devastating phase of his short life. Achilles put the armour on in the early morning light. He ended his feud with Agamemnon with the efficiency of a man who has stopped caring about the original dispute because a larger and more consuming one has replaced it entirely, accepting the return of Briseis and the promised compensation without particular interest, because none of it was the point anymore. He went to the plain of Troy, carrying the shield that contained the world, and everything that happened next happened very quickly, in the way that endings tend to, once the conditions for them have fully assembled. The Trojans saw him coming and understood what they were looking at. The army retreated. The retreat became a rout. Achilles moved through the Trojan forces with the specific, methodical ferocity of someone who is not fighting for glory now, not for Kleos, not for the vindication of honor, but for something rawer and more personal and more terrible than any of those things. And the river Scamander filled with Trojan dead, until the river itself rose up in protest, the god of the river taking physical form and sending a wave against Achilles in outrage at the pollution of his waters. And Achilles fought the river, which is perhaps the most mythologically audacious moment in the entire poem. A man so consumed by grief become wrath that even a river god could not stop him, until other gods intervened to pull him back from the brink of drowning in his own fury. Hector waited outside the gates of Troy. He had decided to wait, or had been unable to make himself go inside with the rest, standing in the shadow of the Scaean gate as the city's doors closed behind the retreating army and left him alone on the plain. He stood there, and the figure of Achilles came across the distance toward him, shining in the armour of the gods. And something happened to Hector that the text records with an honesty that is not unkind, but is not gentle either. He ran. The bravest fighter Troy had produced, the man who had organized and sustained the Trojan resistance through 10 years of the greatest siege the ancient world had assembled, saw Achilles coming and ran. Achilles chased him around the walls of the city 3 times. The walls of Troy were enormous, and the circuit of them at full speed, around and around, while the watching Trojan royalty wept from the towers above, while the gods debated in Olympus, the balance of fates being weighed on Zeus's golden scales, while the whole terrible drama of the war contracted to this single pursuit on the dusty plain below the walls. All of this has the quality of a dream that knows it is moving toward its ending and cannot stop the movement. Athena intervened. She came to Hector in the guise of his brother Deiphobus, offering companionship and courage, and Hector, steadied by the illusion, turned to face Achilles. The illusion dissolved at the moment it was needed. Deiphobus was not there. Hector understood. He met the charge anyway. Achilles drove his spear into Hector's throat at the one gap in the armour, the only point of vulnerability in the equipment that had been Achilles' own, that Hector was wearing, that a man who had worn that armour his entire adult life would know by instinct and by long practice. The wound was precise, and it was fatal. And as Hector fell, he spoke his last words, which were a request, delivered with the full dignity of a dying man who knows exactly what he is asking and why it matters. "Return my body to my father," he said. "Let me be properly burned and buried. Give me that." Achilles refused. He refused with a cruelty that the Iliad does not soften, does not apologize for, does not explain away, because the Iliad understands that grief of sufficient depth produces cruelty of this kind, that the line between mourning and its darkest expressions is one that a person in Achilles' condition could not reasonably be expected to hold. He said things about eating Hector's flesh raw. He dragged the body behind his chariot while the Trojan royal family watched from the walls, and Priam and Hecuba and Andromache made sounds that the text renders with the same direct, unsparing honesty it has used throughout. 12 days it continued, 12 mornings of the chariot circuit around Patroclus's burial mound, the body of Hector trailing through the dust, while the gods looked on from their great distance, and the chorus of human grief from the walls of Troy continued without end. The gods preserved Hector's body from decay, because even the gods had a limit to what they could witness, and Zeus eventually decreed that it was over, that the body must be returned, that the rite of burial was older and more fundamental than the wrath of any warrior, mortal or nearly divine. The night came, and Priam came with it, guided through the dark by Hermes, the divine escort of souls and boundaries, the god who moves between worlds without difficulty. The old king came into the camp of his greatest enemy with a wagon of ransom and a prayer that had no reasonable right to expect an answer. He entered the tent of Achilles alone. He knelt. He took the hands of the man who had killed his sons, the best of them, the one on whose life the life of the whole city had seemed to rest, and he pressed those hands against his lips, and he spoke about fathers and sons and grief and the universal weight of loss. And Achilles, who had been past weeping and past grief into that cold place beyond both, heard the name of his own father in the old king's words, and came back. The wrath released, the way a rope releases when the last thread gives, without drama, simply done. He lifted Priam from the ground. He wept with him. They sat together in the tent, in the way of two people who have nothing left between them except the recognition of what the other has lost, and the shared quality of that loss, and the silence that is the only honest response to it. He returned the body. He granted the truce. He shared a meal with the king of the city his death was meant to destroy. The Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector, not the fall of Troy, not the death of Achilles, not the sailing of the fleet homeward. The poem ends with the burial rites observed, the fire laid, the bones collected, the mound raised, and the last line describes the Trojans burying their horse-taming Hector, and the grief of it moves outward from the ancient text like the rings of water from a stone dropped in a deep and quiet pool, reaching across all the centuries between that imagined burial and this present darkness, arriving still. The fire on Patroclus's pyre had long since settled to ash. The great shield rested against the wall of the tent, its circles of divine imagery turned toward the dark. The cities and the fields and the dances and the ocean's border all held still in the bronze. The world preserved in the god's handiwork, patient and complete. The plain of Troy was quiet, the way a place is quiet after a great deal has happened in it. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of everything that had moved through here, having finally stopped moving. The sea whispered at its edges. The stars moved their slow, indifferent arc above the walls of the city that was still standing, that would not stand much longer, that did not know yet what was coming. But that was for another time. For this night, the fires had burned down, and the grief had done what grief eventually does, found its limit, settled into something that could be carried. And the camp was dark, and the plain was dark, and the water at the shore was dark and still, and all of it rested together in the enormous ancient quiet of a world that had held so much and was simply, for the moment, resting. After the wrath, there was a kind of stillness that settled over the Greek camp by the shore, the stillness that follows the passing of a great storm, when the air is cleared of everything that had been building in it, and the world seems both emptied and oddly clean. The truce held. The Trojans buried Hector in the long, solemn ceremony that the ancient rites required, and the smoke of his funeral pyre rose in a slow column above the city and drifted eastward over the hills of Asia Minor and was absorbed eventually into the blue distance, as all smoke is, as all things are, given enough time. 12 days the truce endured, and on the 12th day it ended, and the war resumed, and the world began its movement toward the conclusion that had been waiting inside it from the very beginning. Troy was not going to fall easily, and it was not going to fall quickly, because even without Hector, even without the Trojan army's greatest organizing intelligence, the walls still stood. And the walls had been built by gods, and gods build things that outlast the reasons they were built. The city endured on its hill above the plain, its towers still casting their long shadows across the silver grass in the low light of afternoon. The smoke of its cook fires still rising in the evenings, the people inside it going about the reduced and frightened business of life in a city that had been under siege for a decade, and now faced it without the man who had made it feel survivable. Into this final, tilting chapter of the war came the reinforcements from the edges of the world, the allies who arrived too late to change the fundamental mathematics of the conflict, but not too late to extend it, to complicate it, to add their particular grief to the enormous accumulation of grief that the plain of Troy had been receiving for 10 years without yet reaching its capacity. The Amazons came first. They came from the northeast, from the lands beyond the known map, where the ancient world placed things it could not fully imagine, giving them a distant geography to stand in, rather than admitting they were simply beyond imagining. Their queen was Penthesilea, daughter of Ares, the god of war, and of Atraea, and she arrived at Troy with 12 of her finest warriors at her side, carrying with her something that the ancient sources describe variously as a mercenary arrangement, a desire for martial glory, or a need for ritual purification. She had accidentally killed her sister Hippolyta, the ancient texts say, in the specific, devastating way that accidents happen in mythology. A spear that went where it was not meant to go, an ordinary trajectory with an unbearable destination. And the grief and the guilt of it had become a weight she could not simply carry in stillness. And so she had brought it here instead, to the one place in the world where grief was already so universally distributed that one more portion of it might dissolve into the larger quantity and become bearable. The Amazons fought well. They pushed the Greek lines back in ways that had not happened since the days when Hector was still alive, and the Myrmidons were still idle by the ships. And for a time, the momentum of the battle shifted with the particular surprising quality that fresh troops always carry into an exhausted conflict. The way a new wind moves differently through sails that have been working with a spent one. Then Achilles arrived at the front of the fighting, and the momentum shifted back. The duel between Achilles and Penthesilea is one of the moments in the broader mythology of Troy that the ancient vase painters returned to repeatedly across the centuries, working it into the curved surfaces of their red and black pottery with the care of artists who understood that what was being depicted was not simply a battle, but something more complex. A collision between two forms of martial perfection that the world would not see together again. The fight was fierce and evenly matched in the way of duels between the truly skilled, where the outcome is genuinely uncertain until the single decisive moment that decides it. And the decisive moment came, as it always came for Achilles, with a speed and a precision that his opponents had no time to account for, and Penthesilea fell. And then her helmet came off. The ancient sources are specific about this detail, about the helmet falling as she fell, about Achilles looking down at the woman he had just killed, and about what happened to him in that looking. He fell in love with her. The emotion arrived in him fully formed and irreversible, the way the grief over Patroclus had arrived, like a weight dropped into the center of him from a great height, settling through everything else and coming to rest in the deepest place. She was beautiful, and she was dead, and he had made her dead, and the love and the grief of it were the same feeling wearing two different faces. It is a moment that the ancient world found deeply meaningful, not because it was sentimental, but because it was true to something about the nature of war that the ancient world understood better than it perhaps wanted to. That the things war destroys are often the very things it would have us believe it is protecting. That the violence and the longing are not opposites, but expressions of the same overwhelming force finding different outlets. That a man who has spent 10 years in the machinery of killing might arrive at the face of a fallen enemy and find there the clearest mirror he has ever looked into. Thersites was watching. Thersites, who appears in the Iliad briefly, is a figure of deliberate ugliness, ugly in the physical description Homer provides, and ugly in his social function, the voice of a corrosive, reductive cynicism that sees in every noble gesture only its most embarrassing interpretation, came forward now and did what he always did, which was to reduce the scene before him to its most contemptible possible reading. He mocked Achilles for weeping over an enemy. He desecrated the body. He gouged out one of Penthesileia's eyes with his spear, which is an act so specifically chosen by the ancient storytellers that one understands immediately what it means. He destroyed the very thing that Achilles had just found in her, the capacity to be seen. Achilles struck him once, with the uncalculated force of a man who has moved past the point where he is measuring his responses against the consequences, and Thersites died. The killing of Thersites created its own crisis, because Thersites was Greek, and Greeks did not kill Greeks without consequence. And the consequence in this case was that Achilles had to leave the battlefield and travel to the island of Lesbos for purification rites before he could return to the war. The ancient world was precise about such things, about the difference between killing in the sanctioned violence of battle and killing outside it, and the rituals required to restore a man to a condition in which he could participate in communal life without contaminating it. He returned from Lesbos cleansed by ritual and unreformed in every other sense, because the rites of purification were concerned with the status of the killer in the eyes of the gods and the community, not with the interior transformation of a man who had seen what he had seen and could not unsee it. He returned to the plain of Troy, and the war continued, and the next great opponent presented himself with the inevitability of myth's logic, which is the logic of sequence, one thing following from the last thing, with the irresistible momentum of a river finding its way to the sea. Memnon was his name, and he was the king of the Ethiopians and the son of Eos, the goddess of the dawn, and he arrived at Troy as Penthesilea had arrived, from the edges of the world, from the far south and east, where the ancient imagination placed the beautiful and the extreme. He was, in the accounting of divine parentage, that the ancient world used to calibrate the relative worth of its heroes, the closest match to Achilles that the war had yet produced. A demigod of genuine stature, the child of a goddess and a mortal king, trained and shaped by his divine inheritance into something that exceeded the ordinary measure of human capability. Their duel was understood by the ancient world as a mirror of the war itself. Two sons of immortal mothers fighting on behalf of the cities that had claimed their allegiance. And far above them, on Olympus, Zeus held up his golden scales and weighed the fates of both men in the pans of that impossible balance. And the scale dipped, and Memnon fell, and Achilles stood above him in the dust of the Trojan plain, and felt the gap that the killing had opened in the air around him. The gap that meant his own death was now the next thing, that the prophecy had moved its final piece into position and was waiting for him to notice. He noticed. He pressed forward anyway. This was the consistent grammar of Achilles, the sentence structure his life had been written in from the beginning, the forward movement into the thing that was going to cost him, as if the cost were itself the point, as if the only life worth living at full brightness was one that would burn itself out. He drove the Trojans back through the Scaean gates, pursuing them into the shadow of the city's walls, into the narrow approach where the walls rose on both sides and the sky compressed above into a long strip of pale blue, and the dust that the retreating army raised hung in the air in the particular way that dust hangs in enclosed places, slowly, with a quality of permanence that open air does not permit. Paris was on the wall. Paris, the Trojan prince whose choice of Aphrodite's gift over Hera's and Athena's had set the entire catastrophe in motion, whose elopement or abduction of Helen, depending on which version of the story one accepted, had given Agamemnon the pretext and Menelaus the motivation for assembling the greatest fleet the ancient world had seen, was standing on the wall above the gates with his bow. Paris was an archer, which, in the heroic world of the Iliad, was a slightly complicated distinction. Not exactly dishonourable, but not the highest form of martial engagement either. Associated with distance and indirection, rather than the face-to-face, hand-to-hand confrontation that the culture idealized. But Apollo was not interested in cultural ideals at this particular moment. Apollo was interested in the debt that had been waiting since Achilles killed Tennis on the island of Tenedos, before the war had properly begun. The debt that had been accumulating interest through every subsequent offence and every killed son of the god, and every act of impiety that Achilles had committed or witnessed without sufficient remorse. Apollo guided the arrow. In some versions of the story, the god took the form of Paris entirely, becoming the archer so that the divine agency of the killing would be unambiguous. In others, he simply stood behind the arrow and directed it with an invisible hand, the way a current directs a leaf on the surface of water, suggesting a course without being seen to suggest it. The arrow found the ankle, the one specific place that the myth, in its later Roman formulation, had designated as the single point where the water of the Styx had not touched, where Thetis's fingers had maintained their grip as she lowered her son into the dark river of the underworld, the one gap in the divine protection she had tried to give him. In the earlier Greek tradition, it was simply an exposed place in the armour, the gap between the bronze greave and the foot, a real and practical vulnerability that any skilled archer targeting the right place at the right moment could exploit. The kind of wound that, in the brutal mathematics of ancient warfare, meant severed arteries, and a man brought down not by a failure of courage or skill, but by the patient arithmetic of vulnerability. The understanding that everybody, however extraordinary, has places where it can be undone. Achilles fell in the dust before the Scaean gates, and the Greek army closed around him, and the fighting over his body was fierce in the way that such fights are when what is being contested is both a physical thing and a symbolic one, when the possession of the body is also the possession of the meaning of the body, of what it represents, and what its loss says about the world that produced it. Ajax, the great Telamonian Ajax, the largest and one of the most formidable fighters in the Greek army, carried the body from the field, while Odysseus held the Trojans back, and the two of them, between them, managed what the occasion required, which was to bring Achilles home to the camp in something approaching the dignity the situation demanded. The mourning was immense and extended and conducted with the full ceremonial weight of a culture that understood death as an event requiring the community's participation, not merely the private grief of those who loved the dead man most. The sea nymphs came to shore, the Nereids, 50 of them, rising from the water in their grief for their sister son, moving on to the beach in a procession that the ancient sources describe as something between a formal ceremony and a sound too large for the air to hold. Thetis came with them, and her grief was the grief of a mother who had known this was coming since before her son was born, who had held the knowledge of it in the cold deep of the sea for the entire length of his life, and had tried everything she could think of to prevent it, and had failed, because some things cannot be prevented, because some futures are too thoroughly woven into the structure of the world for any mother's love, however vast and ancient and oceanic, to unravel. The funeral of Achilles was on the scale that his life demanded. The pyre was built on the shore of the Hellespont, where the land meets the water at the boundary between Europe and Asia, the place where everything in the story had been in transit. Armies crossing, fleets assembling, the whole massive machinery of the war pouring through this narrow channel between two worlds. His bones were gathered from the ash of the pyre and placed in a golden urn, and with them were placed the bones of Patroclus, as Achilles had requested, so that the two of them would remain together in the earth as they had been together in life. The same urn, the same mound, the same patch of ground at the edge of the Hellespont, where the sea moved past in its ancient, indifferent way, going wherever it had always been going. The burial mound was enormous. It was built to be visible, to rise above the surrounding landscape and announce itself to ships passing through the strait, to be the first thing a traveller saw when approaching from the sea, a monument not only to Achilles, but to the idea of Achilles, to the principle that a life spent at its absolute limits was a life worth memorializing at scale. The mound stood there for centuries after the war, visited by pilgrims and celebrated by poets, and used by later generals as a kind of orientation point, a landmark at the edge of two worlds. The armour of Achilles, the second said, the one Hephaestus had made in the night at Thetis' request, the armour with the miraculous shield that contained the whole world in its concentric circles of bronze, became the subject of a contest between the two men who had the best claim to it among the living Greeks. Ajax argued that his physical bravery in carrying the body from the field was the better qualification. Odysseus argued that his eloquence and strategic intelligence had been equally essential to the army's survival throughout the war. The judgment went to Odysseus, as judgments involving rhetoric tend to go to rhetoricians, and Ajax received the verdict with a completeness of despair that tipped into madness in the dark of the night that followed. And in his madness he killed a flock of sheep, believing them to be his enemies. And when the morning came, and the madness cleared, and he saw what he had done, the shame of it was more than he could hold, and Ajax fell on his own sword, and the Greek army lost another of its finest in the aftermath of losing the finest of them all. Without Achilles, the war had to be finished by other means, by cleverness rather than force, by the long patience of a siege finding its final device, by the hollow horse of wood that Epeius built and Odysseus filled with soldiers and the Trojans, ignoring the specific urgent warnings of Laocoon and Cassandra, the priest and the prophetess, who both saw exactly what it was and were not believed, because the gods had arranged for them not to be believed. Because the fall of Troy was going to happen regardless. Because it had been decided in the earliest movements of the myth that this city would fall, that these walls would come down, that the smoke would rise above the Troad, and the refugees would scatter across the Aegean, carrying what they could carry. The city fell in fire. Priam died at the altar of Zeus in the innermost courtyard of his own palace, killed by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, who had inherited something of his father's devastating effectiveness in combat, but not in this moment, the moment of recognition and grief and shared human dignity that his father had found in the tent with the old king, the moment when Achilles had looked at Priam and seen a father waiting for a son who would not come home. Neoptolemus killed Priam at the altar without that recognition, which is one of the ways that the myth marks the difference between the hero and his inheritor, between the original and the echo. The ghost of Achilles lingered, the ancient traditions, preserved in fragments and in the plays of Euripides and the poems of Ovid, speak of the fleet preparing to sail home, the ships being readied and the winds being watched, and then the winds stopping, and a voice or a presence or a divine instruction conveying what was required to release them. The ghost of Achilles appeared above his burial mound on the shore of the Hellespont and demanded Polyxena, the youngest and most beautiful daughter of Priam, as his bride in death, as the prize that the underworld had assigned him in recognition of his deeds among the living. Polyxena came to the tomb with a dignity that the ancient sources celebrate, the dignity of someone who has decided how to face an unavoidable thing, and has decided to face it upright, without performance and without collapse. She said that she preferred death to slavery, which was not a small or abstract statement in the world she was living in. And Neoptolemus received her at the tomb, and did what was asked. And the winds resumed, and the fleet sailed, and the war that had lasted 10 years and consumed the best of 2 generations on both sides of the Aegean was finally, irrevocably over. The Hellespont received the traffic of the departing fleet the way water receives everything, without judgment and without preference, letting the hulls of the ships pass through it toward whatever the survivors were going home to, which was in most cases not quite what they had left, not quite the life the years of absence had preserved intact, because nothing is preserved intact by absence, because time moves through the empty rooms of a life the way water moves through stone, slowly and without ceasing. Alexander came 3 centuries later, or close enough to 3 centuries that the difference is absorbed by the distance. He came to the shore of the Hellespont in the spring of 334 years before the Common Era, at the head of an army that was, in its own way, as extraordinary as anything the plain of Troy had seen in the mythological age. And his first act on crossing into Asia was to come here, to this coast, to the mound that rose above the flat land at the edge of the water, the mound under which the golden urn held what remained of 2 friends who had loved each other completely and died within months of each other, and been buried as they had asked to be buried, together. Alexander came to the mound, and he poured oil over it in the ritual of honouring, and he ran around it with his companions in the old ceremonial way of paying tribute to the heroic dead, and he placed a garland on the stone. While he stood there, his companion, Hephaestion, placed a garland on the tomb of Patroclus, which was nearby, and the gesture was not accidental and was not subtle, because Alexander and Hephaestion had been reading the Iliad together since they were boys, being educated by Aristotle, sleeping with the annotated copy under the pillow, carrying the story inside them, the way a person carries the story that has given them the best framework for understanding their own life. Alexander stood at the tomb of Achilles on the shore of the Hellespont, and understood himself as the continuation of something, as the inheritor of a tradition of excellence and wrath and devotion and early death that had been running through the world since the mythological age, and had now arrived in him, concentrated by centuries of retelling into a clear and burning flame. He picked up the ancient shield from the temple at Troy, the shield said to date to the war itself, and he carried it with him into every major battle of his subsequent campaign, into Persia and Egypt and Bactria and the edge of India, the world of the myth travelling with him into a world the myth had never imagined, expanding as he expanded, reaching as he reached. When Hephaestion died in Ecbatana in the autumn of 324 years before the Common Era, Alexander's grief did what Achilles' grief had done. It exceeded the available containers for it, and spilled outward into everything. He cut his hair. he drove the funeral carriage himself through the streets of the city. He had the doctor executed for failing to save the man who could not be saved. He spent 10,000 talents building a funeral pyre in Babylon that was meant to be visible from a distance, meant to announce itself as a monument, the same instinct that had built the mound on the Hellespont 3 centuries earlier. The understanding that some grief requires architecture to hold it, because the body is not large enough. He organized games in Hephaestion's honor. 3,000 competitors, the grandest gathering of athletes and artists of his reign. And in the doing of it, he was following, as closely as the centuries between allowed, the script that Achilles had followed after Patroclus. The funeral games by the ships, the honouring of the beloved dead with the gifts that the living could still give, performance and commemoration, and the insistence of community on the significance of a particular loss. Alexander died in Babylon less than a year later, in the summer of 323 years before the Common Era, not yet 33 years old. The cause of his death has been debated by historians for 23 centuries and remains genuinely uncertain, which is perhaps appropriate for a man who had made uncertainty the operating condition of everything he attempted. He had chosen the short, brilliant life over the long, quiet one, in the same implicit way that Achilles had made that choice before him, and he had received in exchange the thing that choice tends to produce, which is an extraordinary compression of experience into the available years, a density of event and consequence and meaning that longer lives often spread more thinly across more time. The myth of Achilles moved forward from both of them, from the hero and from the king who had modelled himself on the hero, and it continued its movement through the centuries that followed, absorbed into the literature of Rome, carried by the Roman poets into languages and cultures that had not yet existed when the mound was built on the Hellespont, finding its way into the medieval manuscripts that preserved it through the long, quiet centuries of the early Middle Ages, arriving in the Renaissance in the hands of artists and playwrights who remade it for new audiences while keeping its essential shape, its irreducible core, which is the story of a person who burns very brightly and for a shorter time than everyone who loves them would choose. Shakespeare took it apart and reassembled it into something darker and more complicated in Troilus and Cressida, where Achilles is cold and calculating, and the romance of the heroic is deliberately punctured, which is one of the things Shakespeare did to the stories he inherited. He tested them against a kind of irony that the ancient world had not applied to them, finding what remained when the grandeur was removed, finding something human and therefore still worth the attention. Madeline Miller wrote her novel in the 21st century and gave the whole story to Patroclus, put the narrative inside the consciousness of the man who loved Achilles completely and died for that love. And in that gesture of perspective, she found what the ancient world had always known was inside the myth, but had not always chosen to put at the centre: the love itself, the quality of it, the specific texture of what it means to be known completely by one person and to know them in return, and how that knowledge makes both the living and the dying of a life more vivid, more real, more worth the trouble of experiencing. The story kept moving. It was still moving. It would keep moving for as long as people found in it the thing they needed, which was a mirror for the largest human experiences: grief and fury and love and the acceptance of mortality and the question of what a life is worth and what we are willing to trade for it, and whether the trade ever comes out even at the end. It does not come out even. The myth knows this. Homer knew it, writing the grief of Thetis and the grief of Priam and the grief of Andromache into the same poem with the same care, showing all of it together, the grief of every side, the grief that the war produced on the winning side and the losing side, in such equal quantities that the distinction between winning and losing became by the end almost impossible to locate. The mound on the Hellespont stood over the urn with the bones of two friends mixed together, the winner and the loser of the original dispute, the two men whose love had shaped the whole catastrophe, lying together in the gold, in the dark, under the earth, at the edge of the water where two worlds met. The water moved past the mound in the Hellespont, as it had always moved, carrying the ships of every century through the strait between the seas, west to east and east to west, generation after generation of sailors, passing the mound without always knowing what it was, carrying the commerce and the conflict and the ordinary motion of the world through the channel that Achilles had stood beside in his grief, and that Alexander had stood beside in his reverence, and that the myth had consecrated simply by insisting on the significance of what had happened here, on this coast, in the long, slow years of an ancient war. The mound is still there. The centuries have softened its edges, and the grasses have covered it, and the sea has moved its shoreline, and the strait has continued its indifferent passage from one sea to another, and the mound endures, small against the landscape now, patient and worn and still, the way all things endure when they are rooted deeply enough in the stories that people tell about who they are and what they value and what they are willing to lose. The stories will keep. They have always kept. They are keeping still right now in this darkness, in this quiet, moving through the air in a voice that grows softer with each passing sentence, each word a little lighter than the one before it, each image settling gently into the next, the way leaves settle onto the surface of still water, one by one, without disturbance, finding their rest. The plain of Troy is dark. The fires are long out. The walls have been rubble for longer than they stood. The mound on the Hellespont breathes in the salt wind from the sea, and the sea moves past it as it has always moved, as it will always move, carrying the light of whatever moon is rising across its surface in long, slow, silver lines that go nowhere and arrive everywhere and mean nothing and mean everything, and the water beneath the surface is dark and deep and cold and still. And here the story settles into its final silence. The ships are gone. The armies dissolved long ago into the earth they fought across, becoming the soil of the plain, the grass of the Troad, the salt of the Aegean. The voices that shouted and wept and sang over funeral pyres on this coast have thinned into the atmosphere and become weather, become the particular quality of light over the Hellespont at dusk, become the sound the wind makes in the grasses on the shore. The mound is quiet. The golden urn in the dark beneath it holds what it has always held. Two men mixed together as they ask to be. The sea does not hurry. The stars have been moving all this time, turning on their ancient axis above the plain of Troy, above the strait, above the place where the mound stands in the grass at the edge of the water. And they ask nothing of the night, and the night asks nothing of them. And the turning continues, slow and enormous, and without effort. The way breathing continues in deep sleep, without intention, simply because it is the nature of a living thing to keep going, gently, and without knowing it. The water moves, the stars turn. The grasses on the mound lean in the wind and return, lean and return. The dark holds everything. All is ancient. All is still. All is at rest.